September 1949. The British pound collapses overnight, dropping 30% in a single day, from $4.03 to $2.80. One morning, Britain wakes up and the currency that once ruled the world is worth less. This wasn't a market correction. This was the official bankruptcy of the British Empire. And here's the part that should make you uncomfortable. They won the war. I spent 3 months pulling apart declassified financial records, wartime loan agreements, and economic data that most people will never see. What I found isn't just history, it's a pattern, a mechanism. The kind of thing that repeats because the incentives never change. Britain entered World War II as the largest creditor nation on Earth and left it completely broke, owing billions to a country that was supposedly their ally. And the math behind how that happened? It's worse than you think. So here's the real question. How does a country win the greatest war in human history and end up bankrupt? And if the winner can be financially destroyed by victory, what does that tell us about who actually holds power when the shooting stops? Because this isn't just about Britain. This is about what happens when you fight someone else's war with someone else's money. And right now in 2025, we're watching the same pattern play out again, just with different flags. By the end of World War II, Britain's national debt hit 249% of GDP, which meant the country owed 2.5 times the entire annual economic output. Not total debt. Debt to GDP. The highest debt burden in British history, higher than the Napoleonic Wars, higher than World War I, which had already pushed debt to 143%. Think about what that means. You win the war, you're on the right side of history, and your reward is economic collapse. During the peak war years 1941 to 1942, Britain was running deficits equal to 27% of GDP every single year, and wartime spending consumed 62% of the entire economy. 80% of that went to defense. They were burning through money faster than they could print it, borrow it, or beg for it. By 1945, the coffers were empty. But here's where it gets strange. Britain didn't collapse because they lost. They collapsed because they fought. The cost of victory was bankruptcy. And the country that financed that victory? America. Which leads to the next question you need to ask. Wait, wasn't America supposed to be helping? Let me show you how the Lend-Lease program actually worked. Officially entered the war, Roosevelt signed the Lend-Lease Act. And the pitch was simple. America would supply Britain with weapons, food, raw materials, whatever they needed to keep fighting Germany. No immediate payment required. We'll settle up after the war. It sounded generous. $50 billion in total aid. Britain alone received over $30 billion. $30 billion in 1940s money. But here's the detail nobody mentions. Britain had already spent everything by the time Lend-Lease started. In 1940, before the program even existed, Britain's foreign currency reserves dropped from $14 billion to $4 billion, and they were liquidating assets, selling off investments, burning through gold reserves just to buy American guns and food. By the time Lend-Lease kicked in, Britain wasn't just in debt, they were dependent. And the moment the war ended, Lend-Lease stopped. Not gradually, immediately. VE Day, May 1945, the aid got cut off. Britain, which had been receiving billions in supplies, suddenly had to pay cash. Cash they didn't have, which meant they had to borrow. Again, agrees to lend Britain another $4,336 billion. Canada chips in another $1.19 billion. Terms 50 years, 2% interest. Payments start in 1950. Sounds reasonable until you realize what just happened. Britain fought a war to stop fascism, won, and ended up in a debt trap that lasted 61 years. They made the final payment in December 2006. 61 years of interest on money borrowed to survive a war they were told they had to fight. Let that sink in for just a second. Your grandparents could have been born, lived their entire lives, and died. And Britain would still be paying off World War II. Now here's the part that should bother you. America didn't get weaker during the war. They got stronger. GDP went from $88.6 billion in 1939 to $135 billion by 1944, and war-related production jumped from 2% of GDP to 40%. Government spending rose from 30% to 79% of GDP at its peak. The American economy didn't just grow, it exploded. And a huge chunk of that growth came from selling weapons, vehicles, food, and fuel to Britain. Britain was desperate. America was the only supplier. And when you're the only supplier to a desperate buyer, you name the terms. So, let me ask you this. Was this an alliance? Or was this a business transaction disguised as friendship? Let's go back further. Because this pattern didn't start in 1945. It started in 1914. World War I. Britain enters the war in August, and within 2 years, they're spending over 25% of GDP on the war effort, borrowing massively from the United States. American exports to Europe, particularly Britain, surge. Economy booms for 44 months straight, starting in 1914. American companies like DuPont quadruple their assets. Government loans nearly $10 billion to the Allies, most of it to Britain. Britain wins World War I. And they come out of it owing America billions, their economy shattered, their gold reserves drained. They try to stabilize by returning to the gold standard in the 1920s under Churchill, who was chancellor at the time. It's a disaster. Deflation, wage cuts, unemployment over 1.25 million, strikes that cost the economy $800 million. The decision effectively cut wages across the economy by 10%, just to keep the pound strong enough to maintain international credibility. And 20 years later, they do it again. Another world war, another desperate scramble for American money, another cycle of debt that takes decades to escape. You're seeing the pattern now, right? Let me spell it out. There are 7 stages, and once you see them, you'll recognize this sequence everywhere. Stage 1. A country faces an existential military threat. For Britain, 1914 and 1939. The threat is real, the enemy is real, defeat means annihilation. Stage 2. The country lacks the industrial capacity or resources to fight alone. Britain needed American steel, oil, food, weapons. Without it, they lose. Stage 3, they turn to a wealthy, neutral power for supplies. That power in both wars was the United States. Geographically safe, industrially dominant, politically neutral until it suited them. Stage 4, the neutral power provides aid, but on terms that lock in dependency. Loans, not gifts. Interest, not charity. Payment schedules that stretch across generations. Stage 5. The war ends and the borrowing country wins, but they're financially ruined. The lending country is economically stronger, industrially enhanced, and holds all the debt. Stage 6. The borrowing country spends decades repaying loans during which their currency weakens, their global influence declines, and they lose their position as a dominant power. Stage 7. The lending country steps into the power vacuum. Economically, militarily, diplomatically, the global order realigns around them. That's not theory. That's exactly what happened between Britain and America, twice across 2 world wars. But here's the question that should keep you up at night. Which stage are we in right now? Let's map this onto today. Look at the present global system. Has been the dominant military and economic power since 1945. But over the last 20 years, American global influence has been sustained by deficit spending and massive debt accumulation. National debt is over $36 trillion. The country runs consistent trade deficits and finances its military commitments, over 800 bases worldwide through borrowing. Now, who's the lender? China? Japan? Treasury bonds to keep the system liquid. The roles have shifted, but the mechanism is identical. A dominant power fighting conflicts it can't afford, financed by foreign creditors who gain leverage with every loan. Sound familiar? Because it should. This is stage 4 bleeding into stage 5. Hasn't collapsed yet, but the math is the same. You can't run 27% deficits forever. You can't sustain debt at 249% of GDP without consequences. Britain tried. It didn't work. Now think about this. If you were China or any other rising power watching this unfold, what would you do? You'd wait. You'd keep lending, keep accumulating leverage, and wait for the moment when the debtor can't pay. And then you'd step in. Just like America did in 1945, but who really pays the price when the system snaps? Not the governments, not the politicians, not the people making the loans or the decisions. It's ordinary people. The ones holding the currency when it collapses. The ones whose savings evaporate when the pound drops 30% overnight, or when inflation erases purchasing power because the central bank has no choice but to print. Let me show you what that looked like in Britain. In 1945, if you had $100, that money could buy you a decent amount. By 2025, you'd need $5,500 to buy the same thing. That's a 54-fold increase in prices. Your money didn't just lose value, it disintegrated. And that process started the moment Britain went into debt to fight World War II. They couldn't just print money to pay for the war, so they tried to control inflation with price controls, rationing, wage restrictions. Food imports dropped from 22 million tons annually to 12 million by 1945. Rationing didn't end until 1954. 9 years after the war ended, British citizens were still living under wartime restrictions because the economy couldn't recover. Churchill knew this was happening. His diaries show he was acutely aware Britain was going bankrupt. Lending policies worried Britain would lose everything before aid arrived. And personally, Churchill was broke too. His salary as prime minister, about $10,000, was consumed by taxes and debt. He had a wartime financial shortfall equivalent to $500,000 today. He relied on wealthy supporters who gave him about $250,000 in modern terms just to cover his household bills. The man running the country was personally bankrupt while his country went bankrupt. That's not irony. That's the system working exactly as designed. So let's talk about what comes next. Because if this pattern is real, if it's happened before, if we're already several stages deep, then we need to look at the final two stages and ask ourselves what they look like in practice. Stage 6 is economic decline. The debtor country spends decades trying to recover. Growth stalls, infrastructure crumbles. The currency loses reserve status. For Britain, the pound went from the world's reserve currency to a regional one, and the British Empire, which controlled a quarter of the globe, dissolved. India gained independence in 1947. Other colonies followed. By 1997, when Hong Kong was handed back to China, the empire was gone. That didn't happen because Britain chose to give up power. It happened because they couldn't afford to keep it. Empire's expensive, and when you're broke, you don't get to keep your empire. Stage 7 is replacement. The creditor becomes the hegemon. America took Britain's place after 1945. The dollar replaced the pound. American military bases replaced British colonial outposts. The international order rebuilt itself around American interests. The World Bank, the IMF, NATO, dominance. And Britain? They became a junior partner. Still important, still influential, but no longer in charge. The Suez Crisis in 1956 made that obvious. Britain and France tried to assert control over the Suez Canal. Said no. And that was the end of it. Britain backed down. Because when you owe someone billions and they control the global financial system, you do what they say. Now, if we're watching the same pattern play out again, just with America in Britain's role and China in America's role, what does that mean for the next 20 years? It means we're heading toward a global power shift, not because of war, necessarily, but because of debt. The same mechanism that transferred power from Britain to America is transferring power from America to whoever holds the debt. Keeps borrowing to finance conflicts it can't afford. Does that mean collapse is inevitable? Not necessarily. Britain didn't collapse overnight. It took decades. The debt-to-GDP ratio fell from 250% in 1946 to 24% by 1991. 45 years of slow, grinding recovery. Living standards stagnated. Entire generations grew up in austerity. But the country survived. The question is whether you want to live through that. Because survival isn't the same as thriving. Now, some of you are thinking, maybe we're different. Maybe modern monetary policy changes the equation. Tools Britain didn't have. And you're right, those are differences. But ask yourself this. Isn't that exactly what Britain thought? They thought the pound was untouchable. They thought the empire was permanent. They thought their creditors would never actually collect. And then, one morning in September 1949, the pound collapsed, and the empire was over. So here's what you need to understand. The pattern doesn't care about exceptionalism. It doesn't care about intentions. It cares about math. And the math says that when you borrow more than you can repay, when you fight wars you can't afford, when you depend on foreign creditors to sustain your power, you lose. Not immediately, but eventually. Britain won World War II, and they lost everything. The question you should be asking isn't whether this could happen to America. It's whether it's already happening. Whether we're living through stage 5 or stage 6 right now and just haven't noticed yet. Because the people living through it in 1945 didn't see it coming either. They thought everything was fine. Right up until it wasn't. Here's what I want you to take away from this. Power doesn't transfer on the battlefield. It transfers in the ledger. The country that wins the war isn't always the country that wins the peace. And the country that finances the war, they're the ones who end up in charge. That's the hidden cost of World War II. Britain paid it. And 60 years later, they were still paying it. The real question is who's going to pay the hidden cost of the wars we're financing right now, and what the world looks like when the bill comes due. If this changed the way you see power, debt, and who actually runs the world, you need to subscribe. Because this pattern repeats, and the next time it does, you'll be able to see it coming. Most people won't. They'll wake up one morning, check the news, and wonder how everything fell apart so fast. But you'll know. Because the answer's been sitting in the history books this whole time. We just don't read them.